Welcome to the 24th episode of Inside the CFO Office. We welcome Vinod, CFO at Sauce Labs, world's largest continuous testing cloud of web and mobile applications. More than 2.5 decades of finance leadership experience across global firms like PwC, Salesforce, Adobe, Alida, Bazaarvoice, and Totango, apart from Sauce Labs. How has been your finance leadership journey?
My journey to CFO is different. I originated my career in PwC through three different geographies, India, but largely US and Canada. Then made the transition to Salesforce.com and SaaS had actually started off in early 2011. When I left, they grew to 5 billion. I went on to Bazaarvoice in Austin, Texas, helped them go public, eventually to Marketo, exited to Vista Equity, and sold off to Adobe. I took on my first role as CFO with Alida into customer experience to Tango. Soft Labs is an exception. We offer a testing solution and for all kinds of applications, web, mobile, and all kinds of operating systems. Right, a long, different journey. Learned a lot and seen a lot change in the industry.
The last three companies, the Alida, Totango, and Sauce Labs, we are talking about close to a decade. How has been your journey?
They're all private companies. Help me break away in many respects. What I do is FP&A and of course managing the controllership organization. I also took on functions outside the finance role. Gave me the flexibility to spend more time in the business. You talked about CFOs becoming CEOs or COOs. Right? If you look at Robin Washington's title at Salesforce.com, it's not a pure CFO title. It's got operating officer as well. What really helped me out in the go-to-market motions, how do you actually prepare a budget in line with the business? What verticals, what segments, what micro verticals within those verticals you want to focus on are absolutely critical as you try to get the wallet share in your business. Besides the traditional finance function, I had RevOps, which is the marketing ops, customer success ops, and sales ops rolling into me. Security and privacy, legal, HR, IT. The data that the CFO looks at, and especially coming from the ops team, is very important. And then unifying the efforts of marketing, sales, and post sales as well. People are good at identifying their ICP, but how do you go and operationalize their ICP, right?
How do you believe AI will disrupt the CFO tech?
You can look as foundational as you want. You've got your pipeline metrics and then your conversion to bookings, right? Gross ARR, cost of goods sold, spend expenses, right? And then comes liquidity. That's where solutions like FinFlow definitely help out, right? You can make sure that your accounts receivable is automated, your application of cash, you're signing on customers that are creditworthy. My mandate to my team is take the financial model and run it through an LLM. That's what AI is going to really accelerate that process from a budgeting process, from a reporting process. AI is going to really help out the office of the CFO.
I like your answer. You talked about real applications of AI. You talked about closures. You talked about reporting. I completely agree. Aspect of using AI for an AR product, going into cash flows. What would be your advice for finance professionals?
Build your profile, build your personal brand, right? That's where I've helped a lot of folks under my team take the next step to become CFOs. Always be curious. Always good to step out of your swim lane, get more exposure into the business, understand how the business thinks. But you got to have the foundation of a strategic thinking. How you want to tell that story to the board, to the outside world. Agentic AI is that the delineation to me makes it more goal oriented, right? Not just relying on the system, understanding why a system does a certain thing the way it does.
Hello everyone. I'm your host Amartya Singh, the co-founder and CEO of FinFlow, an AI native product focused on accounts receivable and credit decisions. Welcome to the 24th episode of Inside the CFO Office, where we explore the journeys of finance leaders, discuss the challenges they have overcome, and gain insights into the future of finance. We welcome Vinod today. Vinod is currently serving as the CFO at Sauce Labs, world's largest continuous testing cloud of web and mobile applications. He comes with more than 2.5 decades of finance leadership experience across global firms like PwC, Salesforce, Adobe, Alida, Bazaarvoice, and Totango, apart from Sauce Labs. Today we'll be speaking on the topic of the all-round CFO.
Thank
Welcome,
you so
Vinod.
much, Amartya. Thanks for having me on the show. And yeah, that's great to be here.
Yeah, so I think let's jump into the podcast. The first question we'd love to know, you have been in various capacities as a manager, as a leader, as an executive across different companies. across such large organizations as well as startups. So how has been your finance leadership
No,
journey?
that's a good question. As you just said, I'm the CFO currently at Sauce Labs, and the one thing I will say, my journey to CFO is definitely different to many of the CFOs you would see. I say many of the CFOs with an asterisk in the US, particularly. When you look at the profile of CFOs in the US, a vast majority of them come from an investment banking engineering background. That's the preference out here, unlike the rest of the world, right? So setting the clock back, I originated my career in PwC through three different geographies, Mumbai, India, but largely between US and Canada, primarily helping companies listed on the US exchange in the software and tech space. I've not done any hardware, that is semiconductor, but largely software. And then made the transition to Salesforce.com, which I thought was the best time. The timing was great because that's when SaaS had actually started off way back in early 2011. Saw Salesforce.com grow from 2 billion. That's when I started. I still remember the first earnings call I did for them in January 31, 2010. And since then, when I left, they grew to 5 billion. And I can say proudly, when I left, one of the things I did leave back is actually buying that piece of land where now the Salesforce Tower is the right stands tall, right? But continued on public companies and then went on to Bazaarvoice in Austin, Texas. Helped them go public and good journey. They were in the ratings and review space. And then eventually to Marketo. Marketo is now Adobe. Again, publicly traded, exited that to Vista Equity in the summer of 2016. And then eventually that got sold off to Adobe, right? So that's why. But again, if you look back, focus mainly in the sales and marketing budget, right, from CRM, ratings and reviews, marketing automation. And that journey continued when I took on my first role as CFO down with Alida, again into the customer experience platform, Totango in the customer success space. Soft Labs is an exception. As you pointed out at the outset of the call, we offer a testing solution and for all kinds of applications, web, mobile, and all kinds of operating systems, right? A long journey, a different journey, and learned a lot along the way and seen a lot change in the industry.
Incredible. I think also one important point is that over the last couple of decades, also many things have changed in the economy and the overall tech ecosystem, if I call it, a finance side of the world, right? Be it the 2008 crisis or post that, the entire phase of VC, the entire PVC ecosystem really growing. And then COVID happened, and then again the PVC grew, and now and then there was a lull. Over the last few years, the CFO, the role of CFOs, the role of finance leaders have become really important, especially since the last 3 4 years. Many and more decisions are being entrusted. I also saw a report very recently that more and more CFOs are being promoted to CEOs, which is a great thing happening because companies and the boards are seeing the CFOs as leaders who have a lot of control. And I think also one thing which we'll be also covering in during the podcast is your working with multiple teams, and that in itself is becoming like a, if I may call it, like an executive role who is working with multiple functions. So we'll come to that question later, but incredible journey. And let's go to the next question, right? And I think the last three companies, the Alida, Totango, and Sauce Labs. And obviously, the journey before that has been really interesting. But considering the last three companies that you have been with, we are talking about close to a decade or so. How has been your journey?
So that's another good question. Again, if you look at one common attribute which distinguishes Alida, Totango, Sauce Labs from the previous companies I just stated out, they're all private companies. So that to me was a big change. Having gone through the public company cadence, every quarter, it just comes around the clock. You got the earnings call, you've got the various SEC filings, the various stringent compliance aspects, right? So where I'm heading with this is that the step into a private world, again, as a finance executive, helped me break away in many respects. Of course, as a core thing, what I do is obviously FP&A and then, and of course, managing the controllership organization. And besides that, I also took on functions which extends outside the finance role. But the thing I want to highlight is that working with these private companies gave me the flexibility to spend more time in the business. You talked about CFOs becoming CEOs or COOs. Right? If you look at Robin Washington's title in at Salesforce.com, it's not a pure CFO title. It's got the word operating officer as well in it. Right? What really helped me out in this, because I spent a lot of time understanding the go-to-market motions. I understood what the or promoted the connected thinking that you need, right, between the various functions. I know it'll be a point for discussion again for us in the next few minutes, but going back to your question on Alida, Totango, Sauce Labs, right? The focus is not just doing a budget or closing a transaction. It's how do you actually prepare a budget in line with the business and shape the business according to that budget. And that is like resource allocation. What customer segments do you want to focus on? Middle market, enterprise, right? And I think those are the learnings I picked up from my days at Marketo. Again, if you look at Marketo, they went upstream in the enterprise. HubSpot said we're going to focus on the mid-market SMB, and look where HubSpot is now, right now. Those parallels you see anyway, NetSuite versus, I don't know, QuickBooks in those days, right? Or Oracle Financial, different segments, all offering a similar product, but just different segments, different focus, right? And I think that understanding is very important because as you look at your company as a CFO, you can go after everything, but what verticals, what segments, what micro verticals within those verticals you want to focus on are absolutely critical as you try to get the wallet
Right.
share in your business.
Got it. I think very interesting. I think you at the initial part of the answer you covered. You worked in companies like Salesforce and of the like, and then you moved on to private companies like Sauce, Totango, and Alida. I think one thing very interestingly you mentioned about the entire aspect of earnings, the work you talked about the Salesforce office, negotiating that entire deal for Salesforce, going, I mean, at $1 billion kind of market share, and now it's at a $5 billion. And I think there is a lot of work has gone into kind of companies. And while we are talking about private companies, the challenges have been different. And very interestingly, you mentioned also that resource allocation becomes important, and it's not a straightforward problem statement. It's a problem statement that is linked to the cash flows that you have. It's linked to what is the vision of the company. A lot more things that you have to work. You have to work with VC firms. You have to work with PE firms, right? And so the challenges are much more different and really interesting. And I appreciate that you took that entire bet of working. And we have had multiple conversations on go to market aspect of it, how to go about market. I really appreciate your understanding and your approach to it, that you worked in public companies and worked in private companies, ready to work on go to market, ready to go and work with these kind of growth driven companies, and really working on 0 to 1 or 1 to 10 or 10 to 100 or 100 to 1000 kind of a journey. So really interesting journey at these three companies. And I think in between also you covered that as a CFO you've worked across different departments, and that's what I really like about your experience. And that's something that we have loved to talk about. This is a topic of a podcast about the all-round CFO. You worked across different departments. You've worked with finance ops, you have worked with marketing ops, you mentioned you worked with go-to-market, you have worked with HR, you have worked across different segments. So how has that been? And what drove you to work? Maybe we can divide into three parts. Like what drove you to working the different functions, what led you to it? Second is what have been the biggest challenges? And third is where do you see it moving the lever in
No,
the
that's a
organization?
good question, right? So again, look, as a finance executive, whether you're a VP finance or a VP corporate controller, you always are partnering with legal, HR, and RevOps. The thing what was different for me in these organizations, I not only partnered before getting into the CFO role. As I took on the CFO role, particularly in Alida and Totango, I also took on these organizations to me. So besides the traditional finance function, I had RevOps, which is marketing ops, customer success ops, and sales ops rolling into me. Security and privacy, legal. HR did happen at some point, but not at Alida. And then you got the traditional functions like IT as well. You need to have, let's say, ops under one area. And the reason, again, I go back to before I get into the combination of ops sitting in one, right? You talked about VCs versus private equity. I think the biggest learning for me when Marketo was sold to Vista Equity was actually in their playbook. It was my first experience with a private equity by way back in 2016. And look, the focus is to grow the business, but the metrics that they look and the automation, the process was definitely something I took from that playbook, and then I consistently applied that at my time at Alida to Tango with good results. So that was one element, right? But again, when I go on to certain functions, right? The ops functions, what I would call it, like some people will have a different view on this one. And again, look, everyone's entitled to their own perspective, right? Typically, you had again sales ops sitting under the CRO, you had marketing ops sitting under the chief marketing officer, you had customer success operations, which is your post sales, right? Sitting with the chief customer officer, right? Which is fine. It's just that in that process, I just noticed again, this is my experience, the data was not actually getting lost, leads were getting lost and everything. So I just felt that talking with the CEO, it just made it sense to unify that under one individual, right? It could be the CRO, it could be the CFO or the chief operating officer, right? But it came to me. And the other thing also is, right, when you're looking and partnering with the CEO, right? And the thing that you want your CEO to focus on is on the business, right? And that's what I just said, look, I want you to focus on the business, all these functions, I will take it on, right? And I partnered with them. I understand how these functions work better and it sets them up for success, right? That also led to me taking on these functions besides just partnering with them. Yeah, and as I look at the mandate again between the CEO and the CFO and everything, and just also when you look at the business, how do you split up? And I said, okay, I'll spend more time with sales, making sure, or with marketing, understanding that if the CEO is more from a product background, then he or she can focus more on the innovation agenda. Because at the end of the day, whether you're selling in, especially when you're selling in enterprise software, in the innovation
Yeah.
agenda is the wood behind the arrow, right? The tip of the spear may be sales in a sales-led motion, but really the wood behind that spear or the wood behind the arrow is your innovation agenda. So those were the focus areas as I looked through in these three companies that help us to actually grow the business.
Very interestingly, you mentioned the entire journey that leads were getting lost in between different teams, and that's one dilemma that firms face. For example, you mentioned RevOps is reporting to the sales head, business head, chief business officer. The billing and AR team is reporting to the CFO, and then there is a CEO who handles on the operation aspect of onboarding, right? So I think kudos to you and the team to decide that you took over the RevOps, and it's always good because when three teams are working on the same thing, it becomes a kind of who is going to lead, and it falls in between the cracks. I think that's why it all reporting to you and you looking into it makes a lot of sense. Kudos to the team and kudos to you to decide to do it and take it forward. And you also mentioned working across the HR, legal, and other functions and the marketing ops. If you can highlight one major challenge, did you face any challenge? Because I'm sure the sales ops team, the RevOps team must be reporting to sales, for example. They came on, they were reporting to you, and they must be having their own challenges in the way that their targets are being seen. Did you face that challenge, or did you face any other challenge while taking up different kind of roles
Yeah, no, it
within the
is.
same
It goes back to
organization?
the earlier comments I made. As I said, look, when I look at, I take Alida as an example, or Totango as an example as well, right? Where do you want to focus the business on, right? And sometimes when you sit back and look at all the data, because again, from the seat of the CFO, the marketing organizations are structured, how the sales organizations are structured, how R&D is structured, and customer success post sales, right? So you look back and look at the data and say, what's the pattern I'm seeing in terms? I won't talk about the complex metrics, but just plain pure ARR growth, right? Okay, fine, you know what, my growth was stagnated, but there were certain pockets where my growth was actually good in these segments, in these verticals, right? So that's where the data that the CFO looks at, and especially coming from the ops team, is very important. And that way, it helps in then unifying the efforts of marketing, sales, and post sales as well. I call customer success, and even product for that matter. Kind of what I would say is like a flywheel, right? Okay, fine. Look, I want to focus on, if I pick up a leader, the focus at that point was let's go upstream in the enterprise. Let's focus on verticals like tech, media, healthcare, financial services, and certain parts of CPG. Because especially during the time of COVID, with digitalization was coming on, people wanted to understand what their customers were thinking about the product, right? And that's where we just said we're going to focus on these verticals, which just helped in growing the business. The same thing with Totango as well, right? You got the mid market, you got the SMBs, but again, the product was more positioned towards the enterprise segment. Definitely help us focus on that. So it is like going back to your wallet share. You can't go after everything, right? What are the ones that you want to go after, right? And in terms of your ideal customer profile. So I think that is the challenge I go back and look at. And it's not just these companies I work at. In my experience, again, many companies advise and see the same thing, right? People are good at identifying their ICP, but how do you go and operationalize that ICP, right? Again, if you're trying to go and
Right.
focus upstream on the enterprise, right, it's not just selling features and a product, is going and understanding the pain point and saying, look, this is a value-based
Right.
selling, right? Here's the outcome you can get by this product. And then accordingly, just say you position what kind of products and features that you want to then help that customers solve their outcomes or their objectives, right? So I think that's the common challenge sometimes you just forget in the business because look, everything looks attractive, right?
Got it. One major thing shines through the focus on growth and growth led by product, correct processes, and the correct people. Everything leads on. I think the focus is on growth, and really appreciate as a finance leader focusing on growth apart from bringing the balance is very important, and that comes across in your
Yeah,
discussions
no,
as well.
actually, again, to just add on to say, that's where again you want, if you have a very limited pool of dollars for your demand gen, right? Where do you want to focus, right? Do you want to do the white spray and pray, or do you
Correct.
want to do the targeted spear fishing, right? And that's where sometimes, again, in my view, demand gen activities like events work a lot. We get a lead. Of course, the lead generation time takes some time, but then again, from that, you get the leads in the verticals you want, and then you can have your sales team focus on that and convert those into
Right.
opportunities, which will help the business grow.
I completely agree. I think that's where the average revenue per customer comes into the picture. What exactly are you spending
Exactly.
and how much are you making per customer? completely agreed. So let's move to the next question. I think this is an interesting question, and we have also had a few chats around that question. We'd love to know, how do you believe AI can or has or will disrupt the CFO tech
Oh no, it's
space?
a lot. But you can look as foundational as you want into the typical close process, right? But again, when you sit back and look from a CFO's office, right, when you're trying to do a forecast or a budget, right, it's got a lot of elements into it. I break it down mainly into first is the top line, right, which is your annual recurring revenue. That has a lot of variables associated with that. You've got your customers, your retention, you've got your pipeline metrics, and then your conversion, then into bookings, right, which is your gross ARR, and then you've got your net ARR, which is adjusted for churn, right, or retention. And then as you move down the income statement or the ladder of the income statement, you've got your cost of goods sold. Again, that's the vast majority of the spend out there is your AWS or public cloud infrastructure. It could be Google, Azure, whatever public cloud you're using, right? And then you start looking at the spend, which is your expenses, right? And you start looking at that and saying, okay, fine. And then comes liquidity. So if I were to start with liquidity, right, and pick that up, oh, that's where solutions like FinFlow definitely help out, right? Because you can make sure that your accounts receivable is automated, your application of cash, you're signing on customers that are credit worthy, right? Which is clearly a foundation for revenue recognition, right? So that's where again, when I take that element, you got liquidity, you got certain solutions, you got to apply AI for liquidity. Again, FinFlow is a key part of that. And again, if I go back to the top of the P&L, it's not just, look, you've had that in many solutions, Salesforce, Einstein, and then there was Clary, and where you can then forecast your bookings, right? So again, that precision of forecasting your bookings using an AI solution, taking into account your past win rates, your past conversion rates, the pipe that you've generated, the rep attainment, right, is also important. Of course, it's got to be stress test outside the system as well, right? But that's where definitely AI can help right now. But I personally, I want to now we're just finishing our fiscal year. My mandate to my team is take the financial model and let's run it through an LLM now, right? Of course, there's a lot of LLM. Put the assumption and see what the model is going to spit out, right? So the use of AI is only going to increase. You see this every day when I look at, let's say, Google. I got Gemini out there, whether I'm using Notebook LLM, whether I'm using just my email, whether I'm using Google Docs or Google Sheets, right? They're the same thing. Cloud's got a good plug-in into Excel, right? Where I'm heading with this, Amartya, is it is going to change the office of CFO because the traditional time you'd wait for 3 to 4 weeks for earnings and everything, right? As you fast forward the clock, the expectations and the metrics are going to be real time. Look, attempts have been made to make it real time, but I think that's what AI is going to definitely help out and really accelerate that process from a budgeting process, from a reporting process, and again. Going back to solutions like FinFlow, right? I'm not saying because I'm here chatting with you, right? What's critical right now with liquidity being very tight, you need to manage your accounts receivable. You need to understand which customers, right? Because that way you can manage your cash forecast and then you can say, look, how can I reallocate that back into the business, right? Because we talked about marketing, right? If the marketing spend is seasonal, right? If you want to cut more dollars to your marketing team in, let's say, Q1, right, versus the summer months, which is low seasonal, right, then you collect your cash flows, you collect your receivables, and you can fund that because everything is tied to liquidity, right? So that's why I just feel AI is going to really help out on the office of the CFO.
I like your answer because you talked about real applications of AI rather than going about the global applications of AI. You talked about closures, you talked about reporting, you talked about the financial modeling aspect of it, passing it through LLMs and getting the metrics, getting the results that you want to see, cuts down a lot of time and decreases that dependency on assumptions or decreases the dependency on manual somebody said it should not differ from one person doing the modeling vis-a-vis another person doing the modeling. And that's where you are putting a certain level of order to the chaos in terms of modeling. And you also talked about automation. Thanks for mentioning us, and I completely agree that that aspect of using AI for an AR product going into cash flows or for an EP product getting into cash flows and working it out makes a lot of sense. And really appreciate you giving the mandate to the team to work around AI applications. Loved your answer. Let's move to the last question. I think you have worked across different layers of finance leadership. You have worked on as a manager, you have worked an executive manager, leader, CFO, multiple levels of roles. What would be your advice for finance professionals if they want to become a finance leader?
Yeah, going back to the very first question that you had, I highlighted that in the US, I've always noticed, again, recruiters always prefer someone coming from an investment banking background to become a CFO. And that's always a barricade for someone who's a controller because trust me, a controller knows how to also not only account for transactions, but also forecast them, right? So my advice for folks aspiring to be just a C-level executive, right, is not just is when I look at holistically, right, build your profile, build your personal brand, right? Just as you think about software, right, or you think about the top leading software, they build their brand across customers, they build their brand across just the whole ecosystem, right? So an individual should not be different from that. And that's where I've helped a lot of folks under my team take the next step to become CFOs. And I'm proud to say that, right? So my advice is always be curious. Look, it's good to stay in your swim lane. I get things happen, but it's always good to step out of your swim lane, get more exposure into the business, understand how the business thinks, because you can transact and account for transactions, right? Or but if you don't know the logic behind or the rationale behind and try and influence those transactions, I think that makes the differentiator between being a C-level executive to a certain extent, right? Or not necessarily a C-level executive, maybe a leader, it could be a director, it could be a VP, right? And a C-level, right? But you got to have the foundation of a strategic thinking, right? How you want to then package that, how you want to tell that story to the board, how do you want to tell that story to the outside world, right? And look, I'm not ashamed to say this, right? But it's not just being internally focused. It's also then how do you once you become a leader, whether it's a VP, whether it's a C-level executive, right? You're on point to help the company grow the business. It's not the responsibility of sales or marketing, right? So when you step out and you want to tell the story of your company, you need to actually explain what your product is doing to the outside world. And that's what I call is also marketing in some ways. And I'll be honest, I plagiarize lines for my marketing teams, and I just even spit that out, right? Say this is what it is. Of course, in a much more humanistic way versus a robotic way, right? So that's one thing, and that comes to the earlier question you did about the application of AI, right? Be obviously being vigilant and being caught up on some of the solutions that can help automate some of the redundant processes that you work on and making that distinction, right? Look, workflow automation is one, right? That's always been there, right? But the thing with agentic AI is that the delineation to me makes it more goal oriented, right? If your goal is to understand how do I improve the mix of my customers very foundationally, right, on annual billing versus quarterly billing, that's what you want your agent to go back and look at the data for you, right? Same thing when I look at, for example, how do I then incent my teams at sales marketing, especially on demand gen and pipeline generation between BDRs and the demand gen team to generate the pipeline that you want in the right space, right? So that it could be qualified earlier, right? It doesn't matter who generates it, but everyone wants to get the credit. So making sure that you have that first touch attribution that marketing generates versus MQLs versus marketing influence. Just applying the right level of automation AI that you can get your pipeline data not after the fact, just live as the quarter is progressing, as the month is progressing, to say how you can then, I don't know, change course, right, to generate more, because pipeline you create in a given quarter is will be bookings and opportunities for the next quarter, given a lead time of 60 to 90 days, depending on what segment of the customer is selling into. So a long way of saying, and the last one I will definitely go on to say is just what they call as human in the loop, right? Again, going back foundationally to the accounting aspect. If a system spits out journal entries, right, never say, oh, the system generated this entry. You need to understand the debits and credits behind that, right? So not just relying on the system, understanding why a system does a certain thing the way it does.
Got it. So I think you covered multiple aspects, and let me know if I'm missing something. You spoke about 4 5 aspects. One is curiosity. Finance professionals need to be curious about what is happening in terms of process, in terms of technology. That's one aspect you mentioned. The second aspect you mentioned is the capability for strategic thinking in terms of linking it with storytelling, understanding what the business is doing, and that is linked with how you work with the marketing teams. Take that particular aspect of what the company does, what the company wants to do, building it together and telling it in a way that the world understands. And I'm sure that you have to do a lot of storytelling, not only outside but also with your board and with your CEO and with everybody. So storytelling is another important aspect of work. Yeah, as a finance professional you need to do the storytelling. The fourth aspect you mentioned is solutions, working on different kinds of solutioning, being open to working with solutioning, working with being curious about how solutions work, being introducing AI. We talked about how you are encouraging your team to work on AI. That's another aspect. And that you also covered is human in the loop. anything that do with AI or automation needs to be complemented with a human in the loop, especially for something as critical as ledger entries and bookkeeping. Ultimately, one mistake, it comes to bite back to you when the audit happens, and you're all around going back 5 6 months before and what exactly has happened. So the human in the loop really helps. So I think these were the elements that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Great, Vinod. I had a blast recording the podcast with you. We spoke on a lot of points. We spoke about your experience across mature companies and then private listed companies, both sets of different experiences, working across both sets of radars of companies, working across different functions, how it led on to for you to work with RevOps and with HR, legal, and multiple other teams. We also spoke about how you see AI being implemented and being panning out. We also spoke about your advice for finance professionals and more importantly your finance leadership journey. So I had a blast recording the podcast with you. Thanks, Vinod, for coming on to the podcast and sharing your views and sharing your
Thanks for
thoughts with
having me. It
us.
was great having the discussion, and yeah, good luck in everything going forward.
Thanks, Vinod. So thank you everybody for joining in the podcast and listening to us. I hope you had a great experience. Please reach out to him on LinkedIn. He's very helpful. Please reach out to him for any questions, any queries at any point of time. And we draw to the end of the podcast. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.